And I just want to begin by thanking everybody for joining us. We have a bunch of attendees out there in virtual Zoom land. We can't see you, but you can see us, and you can ask questions in the Q&A and raise your hands if you want to speak during the Q&A. My name, of course, is Stephen Phillips. I'm the director of the Cal Poly Los Angeles Metropolitan Program in Architecture and Urban Design. We're here in Los Angeles. We're part of Cal Poly San Luis Obispo, the main campus, and part of the architecture school. We run a small program here in LA for about 30 students who intern in offices while they're also being educated in studio and practice and history theory classes. They're fourth-year students, and they're there in the gallery. They can all say hi. Anyway, all good. We run these lecture series typically at the Helms Bakery District. They're one of our many sponsors. We're also sponsored by HMC Architects, Morphosis Architects, AC Martin, Co-Architects, Theater DNA, Bulltaup, ARC, Rupa Graphics, and also our media sponsors, LA AIA, ArcConnect, and KCRW DNA. So we have a lot of support. We appreciate everyone being part of our community. And I'm really happy so many of you are here joining us as I watch those numbers go up. And we are going to have a great lecture tonight by Paul Lewis. I consider a good friend from Princeton days, and continuing with a continued journey back and forth between the two, California and New Jersey, New York. We unfortunately didn't get our New York trip this year, so all these students were planning to go visit, and we were going to get to see all the schools and go to the different offices, and Paul was going to give you a lecture, which you're basically getting tonight, so this is super great that he's agreed to do that with us this evening. So generally, Paul will be speaking for about an hour, and then we'll open up to a Q&A, which I'll moderate. So I'm just going to introduce Paul fairly quickly to those of you who don't already know who he is. Paul Lewis, FAIA, is a principal at LTL Architects based in New York City. He is currently a professor and associate dean at Princeton University School of Architecture, where he has taught since 2000. We arrived at the same year, Paul. I didn't realize that. He received a BA from Wesleyan University and an MArch from Princeton University. His New York-based firm has completed academic, cultural, and institutional projects throughout the United States. LTL are the 2019 New York State AIA Firm of the Year. They have received a National Design Award, have been inducted into the Interior Design Hall of Fame, and have received multiple AIA design awards. The firm's recent work includes Poster House, a new museum dedicated to the poster in New York City, the Helen R. Walton Children's Enrichment Center, an early childhood center in Bentonville, I think that's Arizona, that sets a national model for children's health, a new residence hall at Carnegie Mellon University, the contemporary Austin Jones Center, Upson Hall at Cornell University, and the Joseph D. Jamal Lecture Hall at Columbia University. The firm's design and drawings have been exhibited around the world, including the US Pavilion at the Venice Architecture Biennale, and are part of the permanent collections of the Museum of Modern Art, San Francisco Museum of Modern Art.
No,
the
Steven,
Carnegie Museum of Art.
I think you may be frozen.
What?
Yeah, I think he's having internet connection.
Oh no. All right, well
I should come back. Am I not back yet? No.
There you go, Steven, I think you're back on. So we missed the end of that, but
I'm back on. So yeah, no worries. I just, I don't know how I lost my connection, but okay. Anyway, so their newest book is entitled, am I gone again? No, I'm good.
good.
So anyway, can I just finish? I'm going to finish because there's so much to say about you, and it's all good. So LTL Architects are the authors of Intensities 2013, Opportunistic Architecture 2008, and Situational Normal Pamphlet Architecture number 21, 1998. The newest book entitled Manual of Section, with more on the way, an analysis of the history and typology of section architecture is in its fourth printing, which for an architecture book is a big deal. It has been translated into German, Japanese, Korean, and Chinese. Paul is the president of the Architecture League of New York and a fellow of the American Academy in Rome. I'm not sure what you missed of his intro, but welcome, Paul. Thank you for being here.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thank you for having me. This is actually outside of teaching. It's the first time I've done a lecture in this format. So I'm very interested to see how it goes. So I'm going to go ahead and jump right in. Thank you, Stephen. Thank you for having me do this, for welcoming me and giving me the opportunity to kind of share my work to you all. So what I want to do with this talk, and it's a talk that we've been kind of revising and working with for a while since the book came out, is actually talk about the manual section and use it as a way to frame the work of our office. And just as a kind of introduction to the manual section, in effect, what we find very compelling about section is something that we've used instrumentally in the design of our work to begin with, which is that section is this kind of fantastic, pure, in our mind, a kind of purely architectural kind of approach to design that is simultaneously incredibly abstract and also hyper-specific. It allows you to look at things both in terms of the way in which they're organized, but not necessarily the way in which they're perceived. In other words, it gets at kind of issues that are more abstract, having to do with kind of whether it's structural forces or interior-exterior envelope or circulation systems or relationships between social hierarchies, but to do it in a way that doesn't always privilege image. In fact, it's almost kind of section is antithetical to image in the sense of facade and object, at least exterior presence of the object. So, and certainly you all know section as being one of the kind of three canonical representations. It often plays, it's kind of the support system for the facade, and everything's driven by plan. And from the standpoint of architectural teaching, we've always been or had been frustrated about the limits on ways to think about section. Again, it's kind of instrumental in how we think. It's exactly where kind of tectonic kind of specificity of architecture hits into spatial questions and organization. And it's also something that from a representational standpoint has a fascinating history, which I think is also why it's has been somewhat of a kind of less dominant within, say, the last 2 centuries discourse on architecture. That section came in after, as a kind of analytical tool after bodies existed, whether it's human skulls or monuments of antiquity. So section's history is actually a tool to understand that which already existed. And frequently section is used that way in architectural design. It's a way to section through your Rhino model. It's a way to understand the design, to be able to allow kind of technical expertise and consultants to weigh in. And this we find, both a kind of historic precedent and also a contemporary model, but it's ultimately a kind of frustration. So we're much more interested in the ways in which a section could be generative for design. We've also been super interested in section combined with perspective. You get this kind of collapse between the abstract and the invisible with the highly optical and the experiential. So the kind of section perspective is this kind of paradoxical representational technique that we found super interesting. We've used it in our design approach, and it was the kind of basis of the book. So what we did with the book was to, in a sense, try to say, are there ways to distinguish types of section? In other words, are there clearly different ways in which architects produce effects that could be played out through section and means of section? So there's 7 kind of models we put forward, or typologies, if you will, were what we felt to be distinctly different means, although of course most architects hybridize these in interesting ways, and we would never argue that any of these section types have value in and of themselves. It's simply a way of kind of understanding a heuristic model to get at a kind of logic of understanding section. We developed the book around 63 buildings where of a range of scales, from small scale houses to large scale, very large scale buildings. And the key in each of them was to develop them as a single cross-sectional perspective that would allow us to look at the simultaneity of all the things that make architecture pleasurable. So whether it's details or space or organization, program, even to a certain, as much as we could, questions of context and position. But to do each page just as a single drawing, an analytical proposition done not through hundreds of little diagrams, but through one drawing that would get at that complexity. So let me use the different types to get into the kind of, in a sense, a way to introduce our work, if you will. So extrusion is the dumbest section type. It's the kind, if you get a bad review, it's because you basically probably extruded your plan up the height necessary to make the project kind of have a viable space, and you're done. You basically haven't developed the vertical dimension very much. But there are ways that that can be done in an interesting way. So for example, Philip Johnson's glass house is basically pure extrusion, but it does so by then intensifying the role of the glass. So the reflection, the elevations, because of the precision of that extrusion, now allow for this more complex exchange between interior and exterior, between reflection, between privacy, display, etc. So another example of extrusion that gets quite interesting is when you do it beyond conventional heights. So Nervi's kind of amazing palace in Turin, where these things are at 82 feet high and they become a kind of spectacle space. So it goes beyond normal conventions. So those would be kind of two examples where extrusion started to kind of push into more interesting realms. So the first project I'll present that Stephen mentioned in his introduction, we just completed last year, which is essentially all an extruded project. It's purely plan-based. So in a lecture on section, I'm going to start off with a project that's basically a plan-based project. And this is an early childhood education, basically a kind of preschool for ages, very young ages, like 6 weeks to about 5 years, about 200 plus students, 20 classrooms. And it was also a model school for, in a sense, teaching how to teach young children throughout the state of Arkansas. The site is flat. The program with young children didn't allow for any variations in section, not even a ramp or steps. Everything had to be flat. And the budget was very tight, so we knew we were dealing with a very simple construction type, and that most of the exchange would be taking place in plan between the classrooms, between interstitial porches, and then the playgrounds that you would see kind of located in coincidence with the nature of the different classroom types. So the younger kids would be here, gathered around the outside. This are you seeing my cursor, by the way? So. But yeah, so I can annotate, but then you have to toggle between annotation and the PowerPoint, so that's a pain. But so this is slightly older groups, a larger scale playground out here, and then the 4 and 5 year olds would be gathered around the larger outdoor play area. So the project is in effect about developing a project that relates between interiors and exteriors, between playgrounds and classrooms, as well as a kind of an entry court for bringing people into the project. The diagram is based on extruding those double-loaded corridors, and then internal to each of those classrooms, developing a kind of room within a room, so that one would effectively have a kind of quieter kind of gathering point within a relatively straightforward construction, bar joists and metal deck. But you would get this exchange between the houses visible in the hallways, moving to the inside, and even then playing out in the cedar fence that runs around the building. So each room is identified by the image of the domestic house, coded by a particular wood material. That then extends out into a felt covered kind of more private or acoustically slightly separated area that then connects to this outside, very, very large 8-foot wide outdoor screened in porch. So even in bad weather, they can go outside, and then extending out into the play areas. And here you see the traces of those projected volumes on the inside now being manifested on the outside on the cedar trellis that runs around the building. The other thing that was interesting was to try to find a way that that extruded height would start to be mapped out around the landscape. So we were really interested in how we would not just, we obviously had to have a fence relative to code around the playground, but we marched a series of kind of 20-foot high posts around, in a sense, the height of the extrusion of the building, so that it would basically turn the entire exterior and interior clearly into an articulated space. And then more importantly, at the front entry, they would be marked as battens on the facade of the hardy plank, inexpensive construction. But those would then filter out into the front of the building to, in a sense, kind of animate or inhabit that entry cadence. So it was more porous at the entry and then became more protected around the play areas. And then inside, we were interested in ways that you could use the collective gathering point. And this, we kind of referred to this as it's a centralized plan that has no center. In fact, every single one of these corridors misses each other. There's a much more complex geometry. It's not a circle, it's a series of arcs, and each of those have a different centroid. So we like the idea we'd have the efficiency and the clarity of a center, but without the kind of power control of a panopticon. And then internal to that center, we would take the hallways and, in a sense, bring that drywall into the space and billow it out to acquire these much more thick, almost kind of playful, cloud-like, Stay Puft Marshmallow-like qualities to this interior area, and then look at ways that we could use sliding doors to allow that central meeting area to also be a gathering room for the larger community. And here, kind of an image looking up at the various oculi that define this, what we think is a more kind of more interesting heart of the project. So we've done a number of projects over the years that are limited to extruded spaces, and we often play up the intensity of the materials, and there's usually a shift between efficient plans and seductive surfaces, looking at ways that we can invent surfaces within that limited height. So again, if you can't do much in section, can we play it out, play it out through an aggregation of materials that produces variations in elevations as you go up? So here you have the darker felt at the base where it gets hit by people, and then lighter as it goes up to the ceiling. So we would get some vertical dimension, even though we couldn't articulate that very well through any kind of a more complex spatial assembly. And here a view where that surface becomes a kind of signage, drawing you into this bakery. Okay, so stack is also not terribly complicated. In fact, none of these section types are terribly complicated. They're pretty straightforward. But section is basically stacking extruded spaces on top of each other. Now, that's pretty banal. It doesn't tend to produce projects that one thinks of as having interesting sections, but there are ways to do it where it actually is much more interesting. So one is to start to look at difference. So you can have a kind of an A-B relationship, a service serves. So the Lucan model being played out through Mies van der Rohe in Crown Hall, where the lower floor, lower ceiling height actually makes possible the grand space of the studio above it, and again, two different extruded ceiling heights being kind of fitted together, stacked together to produce beneficial qualities for both. Or Lino Bobardi, where you get this amazing series of relationships between this essentially a kind of stacked section, but now coordinated with structure in a totally different way, and most importantly, displaced above the ground. So you get the sidewalk extends in and becomes a kind of public extension of the city in the heart, the very thickness of the section of this building. Another approach is to look at extreme variation from floor to floor. So Rem Koolhaas's analysis of the Downtown Athletic Club made that very clear, where the idea of the culture of congestion being made explicit in this piece of property in Manhattan, where every floor would be unique, a unique program, a unique ceiling height, a unique existence and section. They would all be masked by an Art Deco facade that would actually render that difference actually fairly illegible from the outside of the building. And then this idea of difference in section played out through stacking was moved to a more extreme version, or a more explicit version, I suppose, in MVRDV's Hanover Pavilion. Each floor a unique section height, new material, new kind of environment, in a sense encapsulating the range of Dutch landscapes placed on top of each other to express their difference through their proximity in the stacked section. So we've looked at using the difference in a stacked section to advance an architectural argument in a project called New Suburbanism, where we looked at how the horizontal real estate of a big box store could be used as a territory upon which one could then place the mini mansions. So continue the sprawl, the American dream that manifests itself in sprawl, but do it through section. So be able to enable the continuation, but also the mitigation of the American dream through the role of section. So here you have the big box store below. And the logic of that starts to produce a cadence of the housing McMansions up above, but these are then stretched to go the width of the big box store, and so you get a very different relationship between yard, front yard, backyard, and then probably more importantly, one has to look at being able to commute from the upper level down to the lower, so that we would allow for what we call satirical efficiencies between these different levels, but that they would be separated out relative to visual experience, meaning you would not necessarily see that you're above the big box store. You would have to actually commute around the block. And in the act of doing that, you could open up the parking garage to other community facilities, playing fields, and so forth. All right, so the third model of section that we put forward was shape, and this makes the argument that architects have produced effects in section by not simply working with flat floor plates, but actually contouring them by starting to shape or modulate the ceiling, the floor, or both. That architects have been able to produce effects. Often these are effects associated with structural efficiency or structural alignment in the roof, or they're used to puddle, program, gather social groups because of the nature of the shape, being able to facilitate exchanges that are now have certain hierarchies and certain levels of intensity within that geometry. So a couple of examples, certainly the structural one is most explicit in Felix Candelia's thin concrete shell, amazing buildings. But what's interesting to note here is not only does this follow a kind of form finding strategy, but in so doing, the shape starts to take the scale of this restaurant and break it into smaller scale areas to eat that are then connected to windows to the park beyond. So there's an effect not just about structure, but also about program. Similarly, Utsen's church outside of Copenhagen uses the geometry of the ceiling to, in a sense, choreograph the relationship between the preacher and the congregation, and to do it in a way that evokes the heaven, bring light in, etc. But that also plays itself out in this kind of amazing structural inversion, where in this case, the suspended ceiling is actually external to what appears to be the ceiling on the inside. In other words, where typically in the United States, we suspend drywall ceilings from structural slabs. Here, this is reverse, where the structural slab is actually the ceiling, and then the cladding, the roof, the more rectilinear roof, is placed on the outside with a cavity space in between. So kind of an interesting things that get revealed through section. Nowhere is that probably more legible than in Ronchamp. When you start taking a section, you start to realize the incredible peculiarity of this building, that what appears to be the thickest wall is actually made with some of the thinnest veneers of concrete, whereas the thinnest wall is actually the most substantive. You have this incredible space in the kind of billowing underbelly of the ceiling, and how that has its consequence on program, where it's both a kind of cave-like space, but it's a cave-like space that's pushing, in a sense, out to the exterior, the pilgrimage church, and the hilltop location. I like using this slide to kind of talk a little bit about the difference between the kind of continuous structural shape ambitions of a project and where it starts to hit its limits. So Toyo Ito's this incredible opera house, which was a kind of repurposing of a previous diagram, now played out in this particular project. But you start to see that the shape section is actually not terribly conducive to larger scale buildings, precisely because there's not that much surface on which you can occupy. And when it gets played out as a three-dimensional game, it really often becomes just enclosure. And then you have to insert a series of sections to enable it to actually work. So a kind of difference between a spatial ambition and the pragmatic realities of the limits of the shape section pushed to an extreme degree in the way in which Ito had done it in this opera house. So we had looked at how one could design an entire museum just by adjusting the floor and just by adjusting the ceiling. And this was a kind of strategy largely for trying to win a competition where we knew there'd be, 1,500, 2,000 entries. So we had to have a project come down to a super simple diagram, but be able to be expanded to encompass the very large square footage of the program. So the museum is really just about the articulation of a ground and the articulation of a ceiling. And the strategy was to move beyond the conventional gallery to start to induce greater possibilities. So to, in a sense, get a multiplicity of spatial relationships that would be played out through a really simple diagram. And that we would then also be able to visualize this through the kind of cross-section perspective to be able to, show continuity between the kind of ceiling and display cases, ways in which we could look at the exchange between interior and exterior within the project, while making sure that the entire project is constantly focusing as a series of parallel strands back to the Great Pyramids beyond. We thought this was a great project. We were really, we were convinced we had a shot at this one. We did not win. I don't even think we placed. But as Stephen likes, as Stephen knows, I like to make a joke about this, which is we then recycled this idea for an all-you-can-eat buffet in Las Vegas, which was the challenge of, again, a large program, and how did you break it into smaller scale units so it feels like a series of rooms that are within a larger pancake building. So 600-person buffet, all you can eat, big food service display around the periphery. How do you make this all possible? So the strategy was to contour the ceiling, contour the ground, but to do them in alignment with each other. So you would get these different rooms in which you could gather, but when you stood up, you could actually get views to the food. So you both could nest into the space, but also have the visual continuity that you would want, looking both to the outside as well as looking to the food area. And just to give you a sense of how that works, we become obsessed with reflected ceiling plans. We probably spend more time designing the reflected ceiling plan than we do the plan itself. It's where you can do so much more in the ceiling than you can the floor, because nobody's walking on it. So designing the ceiling is essential. It's not just a kind of technical result. Don't let Armstrong and other ceiling companies dominate how you design. Take it on as a kind of very kind of key component of the project. So, and some senses of how those fields of lights would manifest themselves in different dimmable backlit surfaces, pendants, fields of pendants, etc. So, a different project where we were working with the logic of a kind of volume and how we would kind of contour it was a renovation out in Claremont, out of the Claremont University Consortium Administrative Building, which used to be a maintenance building, and we were asked to convert it into an open office for about 100 employees. And the demand, or the brief said, no one should have a private office, it should all be open. How do you convert a maintenance building into an open office that takes advantage of some of the peculiarities that come with a maintenance building, namely these relatively column-free, large-scale trusses, 30-foot, 40-foot high ceilings? Could we use this to our advantage in making a much more unusual kind of open office space? A lot of our work, as I mentioned before, took place in the ceiling. So not only would all the ductwork and the solo tubes and all of the kind of infrastructure have to be placed in the ceiling because the slab had already been poured, but how would we turn that into an advantage by, in a sense, suspending a series of custom baffles that would form a kind of sculptural territory or cloud that would, in a sense, gather people at a kind of congregating the ubiquitous bleacher seat. But in this case, we liked it because it didn't actually go anywhere. It just went over top of an electrical room that we had to keep in the plan. So it was an effective kind of gathering point. But more importantly, we were able to use the ceiling and the solo tubes and the natural light and artificial light to allow the space to really animate during the course of the day into the night. So it really became part of the life of the project, as well as the kind of gathering point and a sense of organizing the relationships internal to the program. On the outside of the building, we did a similar approach to take the fairly conventional building and use its geometries to do more. So extending those pitch roofs to gather outside areas, torquing the cedar screen up to produce a canopy for a kind of shade on the outside, basically making the building thicker at its skin to make the exchange between interior and exterior more inhabitable. And then even at the entry, that would be the defining characteristic, to turn that screen into a kind of an entryway that would bring you into the project itself. And finally, a kind of shape ceiling that many of you are inhabiting, I appreciate the backgrounds, is a lecture hall at Columbia University in a McKim-Mead and White building. We knew we couldn't alter any of the mechanical ducts in terms of their location because it would trigger a kind of grandfather clause and a reevaluation of some of the aspects of the building that we couldn't get into. So we had to try to embrace really the 20th century technology that had been added to really basically a 19th century building, and do it in a way that both could benefit. So the strategy was to work through a kind of coffer system that would be a kind of programmatically rich or functionally rich. It could be diffusers, downlighting, projectors, stage lighting, etc. And to do it in a way that it does taper up or shaped or is contoured to allow the windows to be visible, while also accommodating all of the stuff that's necessary for comfort and the use of the space as an auditorium. Well, the floor, as I mentioned, is really straightforward. We often try to keep the floors fairly neutral, but it allowed for different configurations that were useful for the project. Just a couple of views of the way in which this acoustic baffle material, fabricated by C2 Studio, was able to accommodate these different geometries played out in section. Okay, so the next section type is really pretty specific to housing and to certain building types that need to maintain efficient uses of their FAR, of their floor, but they want to introduce greater kind of capacities for inhabiting the section. And it plays itself out in two different ways, either vertically or horizontally. And what shear does is basically, it's where architects in the act of stacking their sections have started to look at incremental differences that could produce beneficial qualities in the vertical dimension. So in the horizontal shear, where each floor is just slid back slightly from the next, it opens up one side of the building to light and air. And so Henri Sauvage used that to good effect in his project in Paris. And he was smart enough to realize that the downside to the horizontal shear is that the underbelly gets quite dark. And so by placing these two against each other, he was able to then fill that underbelly with a program that didn't need a huge amount of light, namely an indoor swimming pool. And so the project really is, in a sense, embraces both the beneficial side relative to light, as well as the darker underbelly relative to this particular program. Now, one could look at the mountain housing and realize, as was the case, that in effect it was a parking garage first that was then clad in the housing. And as a result, it could achieve a much greater rake, that it could have actually a bigger underbelly. And then as a result, the terraces, the garden areas, the outside spaces for each of these dwelling units is actually quite expansive, quite open to the air. But it's because the ratio of parking to the interior was not a 1-to-1, but in fact was a parking lot, much larger parking garage than necessary for the housing itself. The other model of shear is to look in the vertical dimension. And this actually introduces often more interior qualities, because what it does is it allows you to get continuity from floor to floor through the split level, allows you to get visual exchange, sometimes thermal movement, acoustic continuity, etc. It can produce a collective that Hermann Hertzberg was incredibly good at using. Through that vertical dimension, he often would place stairs in this area, so you would actually inhabit the vertical shear, and then to move the classroom and the more private aspects of the classroom away from where that shear occurred. Similarly, Diller, Scofidio, and Renfro used this strategy to great effect in the Brown Creative Arts Center, where that shear line was then kind of filled with 2 planes of glass for acoustics, but then allowed for great cross pollination between different performing arts, from dance to performance to music to lectures, etc. Even the ability for one to pass through the building and kind of get a glimpse as to what's going on within the building simply through the agency of the section. We, in a much smaller project, worked with the vertical shear in a townhouse. This was combining two different apartments, and so we actually benefited from the misalignment of the floors of those apartments and filled this joint in with a staircase that became a kind of site in and of itself, but it also distinguished between kind of more private gathering areas, reading rooms, etc., and the larger, or I should say slightly larger, living areas adjacent. So the vertical shear really defined the project. It became the location of the stair. All right. So the next model, and I again will reiterate, these are not conceptually challenging types, is whole. And whole at some level is simply the removal of a chunk of floor plate that then has benefits in the act of its removal. And this often goes to the fact that, you know, when you don't build a portion of your floor, you have to, as an architect, often justify it. So holes can be everything from pragmatic reasons, elevators, mechanical shafts, etc. But they can also start to be used to organize entire buildings. So one could think about, or we like to argue, that Corbusier's Weissenhof-Siedlung, small kind of prototypical house, is basically a hole that allows for the double height space that sets up the hierarchy of the interior program, allows light to come deep into the floor plan, and so forth. So it involves removing a certain amount of square footage from the house, but the benefits outweigh that removal. Similarly, that approach to a kind of a double height space or a hole now taking on the entire building could be seen in the Larkin building by Frank Lloyd Wright, where the entire project is really internally focused towards this large grand atrium that not only is the identity, it's the social heart, it's part of the mechanical cleansing system of the building. In a sense, this void becomes the substance of the project. You could look at the Ford Foundation, make a similar argument that the architectural quality of this is, in a sense, the absence, the whole. And again, it's nice to notice here that there's a bit of a horizontal shear taking place here that allows the plants to grow and to be able to use the underbelly over here as an entryway into the building. So section types don't operate in isolation. They're much more interesting in combination. And then probably one of my favorite uses of the whole was the kind of counterintuitive approach by Toyo Ito, where the column, usually a solid substantive entity, is now morcellated and becomes the connective tissue that not only holds up the building, but also forms the circulation, forms the optical connection, becomes the connective tissue literally that separates and also connects throughout this entire building, which, by the way, has a series of stacked sections of which each section is unique. So, all right. So we often look for ways within programs like residence halls, which tend to resist section, not just from a budget standpoint, but also from a standpoint of the efficiency of these construction types, to try to find a way that we could use the stair, the communicating stair, quite literally as a communicating stair in an extreme degree for Gallaudet University, because it's a university for the deaf where sign language is essential to everyday life. So in a sense, pulling the stair away from the edges of the floor, floating it to allow for greater visual continuity, sight lines for sign language, was essential to allow conversations to occur on the stair as well as from the stair into the various lounges that are adjacent to it. In the lower level, this issue of optical communication became really interesting. We needed to find a way that we could make the lower floor lounge have areas where people could gather, but also be able to enable this to become a kind of an auditorium. So this really got more with the shape section, the kind of sloping and the terracing of these levels to allow this to work in multiple ways for the specific demands of this university. With the project we've worked on kind of on and off for about 10 years in Texas, we were working with an existing building, and so a lot of the questions where how could we tactically modify this building that was at one point just a proscenium theater, but it had acquired a department store, so it had a floor that was placed inside what was otherwise an open space. So how could we strategically open up that department store while still taking advantage of that upper floor as a main gallery area, while also solving some of the circulation problems, the mechanical problems, et cetera. So this was done by focusing a lot of attention on things that move between the different levels. The staircase in particular became the kind of heart of the project. And for us, we were trying to find a way the stair wasn't simply kind of placed in, but actually started to stretch out and connect to other aspects of the architecture, that it had this base that really came out of the concrete floor, and then was connected to a series of suspended stair treads that would drop down all the way from the roof deck, extending down about 35 to 40 feet. Each individual tread would have to be put in place individually and bolted to the floor slabs, to the holes that we had cut in the floor slab. And so here, actually, the finished stair was going in before the building had even been closed in. Each one was craned in and carefully kind of slotted into the structure within the project. And because of the slope, which was the slope of the stair in both axes, was a product of taking the nosing of the stair and extending that incline to the rest of the geometry. But that meant that you had a stair that would go from about 5 feet wide at the base to 8 feet at the top. So it basically opened up as you moved to the main gallery. And it meant that you could stand in the main gallery and look down and see all the way through to the sidewalk beyond, which we felt was important to connect the project as much as possible through these different layers. Here, a view from below looking up at the space that's revealed moving up the stair. More recently, we had the challenge of the program and the organization had shifted from art house to the contemporary. We did a round of upgrades to improve some of the mechanical systems to bring it up to museum standards. They were going to be bringing in and have been bringing in quite substantial and really quite amazing installations, but it brought in the issue of we had to get crates up there, and the original design was not set up to enable that scale of movement. So rather than lose a whole bunch of real estate to a freight elevator, we worked with a scissor lift that would be used to, in a sense, kind of move stuff up and down. And then, and my favorite moment is then the floor returns and basically the space goes back. So it was a way of kind of enabling the movement in the section, but without compromising the square footage that you often lose through holes. Just some other examples of features in the building. We had looked at ways that you could have large-scale pivoting walls based on reinforcing the upper structure, which we had to do from a kind of structural standpoint. That had a series of tracks and enabled us to do these kind of operations. And then the roof deck, which turned out, based on the original renovation, was one of the more popular spaces. We had the opportunity to come back and make it better relative to the Texas climate by placing a canopy on it, a shade canopy. So that, in effect, was a kind of an extruded section, but we did it at a height that was at 23 feet with a knife edge, so there would be as weightless, or the appearance of weightless, as possible. It's sufficiently high that it really does feel as though it's not just a conventional floor. It becomes a backdrop for Jim Hodges' text, or his art, with a text of "With Liberty and Justice for All," which is a kind of fantastic marker in the heart of Austin, Texas. It's a kind of great backdrop for protests, and I hope it continues to be, although I'd like the nature of the protests to shift a little bit in Texas, but that's another story. And then the roof deck, we were looking at ways that we could find a weather enclosure, and I had looked at a kind of screen that could be tracked with these high curtains that could be that could enable the space to be transformed from an outdoor room to something that has a more gossamer interior consequence. And what I think is very effective about this space is it enables a sense that you are part of the museum, you are part of its kind of interior, but the ceiling height enables this connection to the city that doesn't make it feel like you're purely within the confines of the museum. Okay. So incline is a peculiar section type that comes with some difficulties. On the one hand, it seems to be very straightforward. It seems to enable a way to link a plan to a plan without having to deal with the distinction or the separation between those floors. So basically, you can go from a floor to a floor by simply oozing the plan into the section. The downside to incline is that whatever continuity you produce, it comes with actually, and in some ways, a much greater discontinuity. So what I mean by that is that in Villa Savoye, you get about 3 feet of continuity up the ramp, but you produce 10 times as much discontinuity across the plan. And that struggle of trying to deal with this disproportionate relationship between continuity and discontinuity is kind of at the heart of a lot of projects that are based on inclines. And they get developed in different ways. So you could look at Frank Lloyd Wright's Guggenheim and say that to a certain degree, this is essentially a continuous ramp whose discontinuity is absolved by Wright inserting in a very large hole or an atrium. So that where you would have had discontinuity from side to side, it's now opened up through visual continuity, and the physical discontinuity is in some ways absolved because of the intense visual exchange that can take place through this area. In a very different way, but with a very similar diagram of a continuously unfolding museum, OMA and Koolhaas developed a project where that discontinuity was actually intensified. So it's in a sense diametrically opposite logic from Wright and the Guggenheim, where here the extreme proximity along the incompatible or the shear lines of those ramps is in fact the heart of the project. So the peculiarity of bringing an exterior walkway in that immediately forms an entry in the heart that leads right into a reception desk that is now in part of the auditorium, moving down into the galleries only to emerge at the top of the auditorium to extend up to the roof, etc. So it's basically constantly sideswiping. The project is constantly intensifying the sideswiping effect of programmatic difference. Again, that is part of the built-in difficulty, if you will, of the incline. So we, in a project called Park Tower, like many architects, tried to develop a continuously unfolding ramp. And we tried to figure out a way that we could take the emerging technology at the time of electric cars and hydrogen vehicles. And if you didn't have the toxic emissions from a car, could you actually have a drive-out skyscraper? Could you get car parking and program to be much closer together to basically have a double helix of a skyscraper that would go from retail at the lower level where you needed more parking through to a kind of hotel level, less parking required, to an office level, and then finally up to a residential level where you had the least demand of parking. And intertwined throughout this section would be a series of express ramps. So you could either go the continuous ramp up the parking lot, or you could use the express ramp and work your way to the top of the building. But in the act of doing that, we were trying to find ways that we could take conventional programs like strip malls and wrap them around each other, take parking lots and wrap or stack them underneath the strip malls, and then in the act of linking them together, similar to Wright, but also drawing on Koolhaas, get that kind of proximity into a kind of seductive mix. So you could both get exchange, optical connection, every parking lot is a good spot, and every space is a good spot, and you can get access to your big box store through a more interesting social center, or social atrium. The hotel floor merged the kind of lowbrow motel with the John Portman atrium, the spectacle with the mundane. So you again you park right above your hotel room or your motel room, descend down. These collect effectively wrap around the more spectacle-like atrium, complete with the express ramps flying through there, and even ways that we could get the swimming pool and the parking garage as a kind of diving board to link all of these things together. And then on the residential level, looking at ways that you could kind of park on top of your vertical unit, and that now your neighborhood might have patches of grass, but then they're stacked vertically as opposed to sprawled horizontally. All right. So the last model of section is nest, and this is actually quite a bit different. And I think actually at one point we had nest divided into a couple of different types, and then at a certain point we said, look, let's just for the sake of clarity argue that it's its own type. And what distinguishes nest from the other section types is that it's where architects or the design has been foregrounding the kind of the volume of a component rather than the floor slab of an approach. So, it obviously, once you start doing that, you can nest in multiple ways. You can look at different ways to either overlap, intersect, scale, etc. And certainly that's been used to good effect. So a kind of very diagrammatically clear example of this is Fujimoto's House N, where not only do you get a room or a house or room within a house, but you also get a perimeter that is closer to the property boundary that doesn't distinguish between an environmentally interior and environmentally exterior. Air can move through this, but it starts to stage the house as this more complex exchange between these nested Russian doll like figures. A slightly different version is Charles Moore's use of the nested kind of skylights or these theatrical spaces where the dining room and the bathtub in the heart of this relatively small cabin are bringing light in, become kind of ceremonial spaces within a really quite simple domestic assembly. Or Beinecke Rare Book Room, where now you're starting to look at some of the environmental benefits of nesting. Here, the Rare Book Room is environmentally or humidity controlled in ways that are different than the space around it. And even that privileged kind of skin, translucent stone skin, is made possible because of all the buried program below the plaza. So again, a kind of nested section that's dependent upon a more complex building development. And then a very explicit example of a thermal kind of environmental diagram that the nesting strategy allows is Jorda's Mont Cenis Training Center, where you have a photovoltaic, completely passive skin box or shed, giant shed that's placed around two fairly straightforward buildings, and in so doing produces an interstitial layer that can modulate between the extreme temperatures of the outside and the interior by producing this interstitial layer. So we've been really interested in the nesting model in some recent competitions, in particular a project that we won in Telluride that had actually an existing stone wall. It's one of the oldest fragments, kind of extant fragments within Telluride. And the question was, how do you design this as a performing arts center where you might have different performance criteria of the envelope? And certainly one wouldn't want to come in and kind of just simply seal off this porous brick, because that's actually its unique character. So we knew very early on that we were going to be looking at placing a building within the building, and to do so both from an architectural quality, but also from an environmental one. So we would see this as a kind of interstitial exchange that would both engage program, but also temperature and humidity. We could have the stone walls, place inside of it a timber figure, kind of CLT figure, complete with a fireplace at the top, and then use glass and operable devices to start to be able to fine-tune the environmental characteristics between the stone and the timber. And then the project really is about the exchange between these two different materials and two different thermal programmatic conditions. So here, say in weather conditions that are colder, it could be sealed off, but then it might open up if the weather gets better and be able to be used in nighttime as well. we wanted to find a way that the building and its sculpting really does kind of stage the relationship between, say, the stone wall, so how the building itself gets opened up as apertures for the stone, looking at the staircases staircases and actually elevator inhabiting this interstitial space, so that you can move up in this kind of gap between the stone and the wood, up to the main gallery level, which is on the second floor. And again, even that as kind of the idiosyncrasies of that are about misaligning different windows from inside the gallery to the existing windows on the building exterior skin. And then the rooftop, which gets above that stone, but now is able to look at the amazing box canyon of Telluride that exists beyond. We tried to, because it was a competition, we had to sell this idea at every single level. So even the model case that we used was based on the same strategy, where we would have the ability to unveil the project, but also recapture it, or basically push it back into a nested box. So we're very pleased about winning this competition, and we're still optimistic that the project will move forward, and we'll keep our fingers crossed. So I think the last project that I want to show is a museum we opened recently in New York City. It's a museum for the poster. It's one of the, certainly the first museum dedicated to the art of the poster in New York, and one of the, a kind of unique opportunity to think about how one displays that type of medium in a museum dedicated to it. So the space was defined by a series of these cast iron columns going all the way down. It stretched mid-block from 23rd Street to 24th Street, about 220 feet long. It slopes about 2.5 feet from the north to the south continuously, so it's not a flat floor. And we knew we were going to have to figure out a way to engage this original existing space dealing with similar questions of humidity. So this is the kind of diagram of the volume of space we were given. The question was trying to figure out how we could kind of nest a humidity controlled gallery while still allowing a public promenade, so that in a sense the posters could be exhibited in a kind of space, a street-like space that is the origin of the poster, or one of the original sites of the use of the poster to begin with. Went through a series of different approaches to do that, whether it was a wall or a figure or a volume. And we ended up with a kind of operation where we would open up more of the gallery to the north side, to the 24th Street side, and open up the public entry area, the bookstore, and some of the entry sequences more towards the major entry on 23rd Street. And then by starting to kind of torque some of the lines that would produce this, we were trying to find a way we would actually, in a sense, make you feel like you're moving into a space that itself, at every step down the length of this promenade, the section would be changing. And that the intersection of these two lines that are defining the major geometry of this form, that they would occur at the entry gallery. Whereas the other side would be developed as this kind of built-in piece of furniture for the bookstore, a kind of waiting area, the coat room, the cafe, the ticket desk, the descent down the stair to some education facilities and additional galleries below, as well as a kind of cafe waiting area towards 24th Street. Here you see the kind of long section, that slight shift as you go down the model, looking at how this was developed. And I think this is a sequence of sections that are moving through the project, showing how every 5 feet the section shifts, so you move into the humidity controlled gallery and then back out to 24th Street. So here's some views of it, and we really like the fact that you get this kind of split screen, that this line, this clay kind of volume, and these lines, these steel lines, I should say, are actually drilled so that you can actually kind of pre-mount or it's basically a hanging system for the posters. Plus being able to have a kind of display desk be part of that system, and get that kind of registration of the split between the galleries over here versus the more continuous promenade, the wood. This is the existing wood floor, existing brick, existing vaults, etc. So the new nested volume being placed and it's attenuated down the length of the space. A view back, again, this very large. I will say building a 220-foot piece of millwork with a floor that is constantly sloping is a bit of a nightmare. But it means that basically your kick is constantly changing and adjusting, and became kind of an interesting question. Here, a view in, we were really interested in ways in which the columns could appear and disappear, and their capitals, working with lighting designer Lumen. Architecture, I think, did a fantastic job finding ways that those, we would both bury the columns, but then reveal them and illuminate them and through that thickness, which kind of getting away from the idea that either you have to bury the column or display it. We would do both. So, and then there's some details. Vaco did a lot of the fabrication of the metal, and then some of the work going down into the lower level. And at the front of the building, we placed in the picture window a green screen room, so you could actually embed yourself in posters. So this is my son, the Attack of the 50-Foot Woman here, and wanting you for the U.S. Army. So there's something nice about the fact that the architecture enables you to now inhabit posters, and even the urban section being played out at this different scale. So anyways, so hybrids. Hybrids, as I mentioned up top, are really where most architects who do interesting work in section, this is where they spend their time. And but for us, we like the idea that one can now look at Sano's amazing Rolex Learning Center and say, well, actually, it's a extruded stack section that's been shaped for certain reasons and then perforated with a series of holes that bring, so each of those section types are being played out here, and they have different consequences, but they're being arranged in very different ways. Similarly, Kengo Kuma's tourism center is basically a series of stacked shaped sections, which is, you're probably saying is, well, that's kind of paradoxical. Well, it is, because there's an incompatibility there. And so that's where you get these kind of interstitial spaces that are kind of recede back from the facade of the building in order to enable the stacking to be legible. Or another kind of stacking of shaped sections, but now arrayed around an atrium by Herzog and Miron. And then the architectural petting zoo in section of the Seattle Central Library, inclines, holes, shapes, etc. Kind of an amazing tour de force of section by OMA. So very quickly, how am I doing on time? Should I stop? I could stop. Should I stop? So I can very quickly just show, often this is useful. The way this was done was to develop these things in incredible detail in Rhino. We used existing buildings to be able to get access. We needed to get access to working drawings and work through photographs, but we also went to archives, met with, say, Buckminster Fuller's kind of associate partner, Shoji Sado, to get access to the working drawings, to be as precise as we could with these things. They would be modeled interior and exterior. We spent a long time trying to figure out, all right, if you had to have a single view, a single cross-sectional perspective, where would it take place? Interestingly enough, in the Bucky Dome, we didn't want to take it through the center. We actually moved it just in front so you could actually see a better sense of the three-dimensional volume. The interior was modeled as best we could based on archival photographs. And then even the context was modeled as much as we could, recognizing the impossibility of doing this accurately, because you're drawing a section, you're drawing through something that you can't actually see. So there's an inherent flaw. We would have the pleasure of redlining these things to try to figure out a way to get consistency in order to get to a drawing that would be as consistent and accurate and be a kind of a scholarship. We like to regard it as a kind of visual scholarship in the discipline. Very lengthy, time-consuming. I think anywhere from 120 to 160 hours for each of these drawings to get them done. We had a great team of people working. No free interns, but an amazing collection of people who worked on this over 5 years to develop the project and to try to find consistency. We ended up having to have someone just do clouds for a period of time, or just do people to get these all together. And just finally, we did use it as an excuse to test out how it would work as a coloring book, and it produces very different effects when it gets colored. Our forays into becoming coloring book publishers were a bit of a disaster. We don't sell the coloring book anymore. I think we only printed 30 of them. But nonetheless, we thoroughly enjoyed the process of doing the manual, and find that it actually has influenced how we not only think about our work retroactively, but also how it's instrumental in how we move forward on current projects. So thank you. It was a pleasure to present this, even though I had no feedback. I have no idea whether anyone heard this. It's the downside to the virtual. So, but anyways, I know that everyone in my apartment heard it. So that's, I guess, something. So, anyways, I will stop my share. Yeah.
On mute, Stephen.
What's that? So I guess I'm more than willing to ask or answer questions. What do you think is the best format, Stephen?
Yeah, I'm having a slight problem unmuting. Can you guys hear me?
Yeah. Yeah.
Great. Well, usually I do my little moderation thing. Thank you, Paul. That was awesome. Your work is fantastic. You've really got a very strategically well-organized project to categorize your whole way of thinking, which is pretty impressive in some ways. And I know there are going to be questions about your drawings. Historically, your drawings were quite unique in their origination, and then as they lasted through the digital decades, and then now are probably having a revival, it's quite interesting. And so maybe you can talk about that in some ways, but I also kind of wanted, something that came up while you were talking was I started thinking a lot about outliers. And I know you must have come up with some outliers that didn't fit into your logics of thinking. I mean, there's something really interesting about organizational strategies, and now I know you're starting a new book on, I guess, well, I don't know if you're supposed to talk about it or not, so we'll leave that to you to discuss. But whether or not, how you end up creating a series of strategies or studies of organization that delimit or define things in order to then create the hybrids, which are fantastic, which fit but don't fit. But then there's probably were a series of outliers that didn't even fit at all because your system of thinking is such that it doesn't, in order to explain and to develop and analyze to this level of sharpness and conceptual sophistication, can't possibly fit in yet.
Right.
I'm wondering how you think through that problem.
Yeah,
especially
no,
as,
it's a really interesting question, because I think that one of the difficulties is that we wanted to find a way that we were arguing for dominant types, meaning it's not exclusive, meaning I would be the first to say that there are so many more ways to operate in section. These are what we felt, and looking at this for a number of years, were the more dominant. Like these were reoccurring strategies that get used, and in a sense, if the goal was to provide a degree of clarity, if not dumbness, meaning these are not conceptually complicated, but in the act of doing it to provide a sense of difference, a kind of device for articulation and clarity, we knew that we would have to not be comprehensive, right? And so that was one question. And there was certainly, there's approaches to, a good example is at one point we had one of our section types was platforms. The idea that you would have everything would be intermittent, that it would be a combination of a separation between the volume and the floor plate. It was somewhere between nest and shear. It was something very different, right? We end up not focusing on it because we weren't coming across enough examples that we could say that this had a dominant type. It was a kind of a hybrid possibly, or maybe it just didn't fit. So that was one way of kind of, a kind of critique that we know is that there are all kinds of other more nuanced, idiosyncratic, inventive approaches to section that we just didn't touch on. The other thing that we knew was going to be a limit is that the medium of the book and the idea of a single drawing also came with it a kind of restriction that we had to deal with. Namely, there are ways of thinking about section that are not, or buildings through section that are anything but the static single cross section, right? That, you know, that it's the iterative, the multiple, the varied, etc. And given the fact that we had privileged a single cross-section view, given the nature of the unfolding of the book and the, you know, the idea of the spread, the diagram being turned into one drawing, that became a limit. And at one point we were looking at doing 2 sections for each building, and therefore we could look at the kind of complexity of 2 sections. And again, we decided, all right, for the sake of clarity, legibility, drawings fitting to amount of real estate that the book could be, that became a kind of, that happened as well. But yeah, I think for me, it's really interesting to look at how classification systems or ways to organize your thinking are inherently going to bring with them things you're going to exclude, and that's part of the nature of it. But it's kind of, for us, that was a that the attempt to be everything would itself become a problem. And so yeah, but I think it's a really good question. So really good question.
It just touches us thinking about contemporaneity and how, you know, most of the great projects you looked at were by great architects, of course, what we define as a great architect. And so I'm just, as you go into the next project, I'm kind of curious if idiosyncratic can't become, but then it becomes a category. And that's sort of like what the LA school kind of claims itself as. And now they're an idiosyncratic group of architects that are a clear school of architects. So I don't know. I'm just posing it. It just was something really fascinating in your topic. Does someone else have a question in the gallery group here?
Actually, there's 2 questions from the Q&A session. So Henry has a question.
Henri wants, let me go up there. And I'm not at the top of my screen. That's interesting. He has a, is this Henry DeHaan?
Is that the
I don't
question
see his
about,
hand up.
could you comment on your section types as they pertain to those developed by visionary architects when dealing with future cities? Is that the, I see a question here. Is that the one you're referring to?
Oh, is it in the chat?
Yeah,
it's in the chat. I'm sorry,
okay.
It's in the chat. I'll open up Henry so he can talk and ask that question. Sorry, Henry. That just opened up in a different spot. Here you go. You should be able to speak.
Well, I can dive in on it because it's really
ask the question and answer it.
Yeah. I think it's a really good question. I heard a voice very faintly there.
Yeah, he should be able to talk. Talking is permitted. Henry?
Yeah,
Henry's our former chair, actually, of the architecture school. Yeah.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Come on in.
Okay. Thanks, Paul. I was just intrigued with all the sections, and I think you have covered them in such distinction. But when I start looking at the cities, I'm wondering also, how do you think your approach would be investigated in cities such as Le Corbusier, Alphand, Futurism? And also, I have this wonderful postcard that I think you know really well. It's of the 1930s with this whole way of thinking of the layering of New York City, the vision of it.
Yeah.
And it seems the section was also part of the future of urbanism, the promise. And I just want to hear a little bit your thoughts on that.
Yeah, no, it's a great question, and it also goes back to the other question as well, in that we made the decision that we were going to look at mostly the consequences on the interior of section, meaning the interior space of buildings less than the exterior, with the exception probably being some of the work on Sauvage. But I would say that one of my criticisms of the book is that too many of the projects are object buildings. They're isolated. They're not in cities. And that, you know, Lino Bobardi's is, I think, an exception to that. And I'm super interested in those aspects. But I think But it is there's no question that the work focused primarily on what one gets relative to the interior. I think the other thing I would point to is that there's an amazing book by Vincent James and Jennifer Yost called Parallel Cities that is incredible. It has taxonomies of urban sections. And so in some ways, I like to point to that book and say that book does an incredible job at doing what we failed to do. So it's an exceptionally good book at getting at an analysis of the ways in which section could be played out on in a sense, largely the exterior of interior of buildings, and as they gather around to produce urban spaces and public spaces.
Thanks.
There's a question by Meredith. I think you can speak now.
Yeah, is Meredith there?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for a really excellent lecture, Paul. I'm curious, the book has been so successful. And so I'm really curious about, how you and your firm were inspired and decided to initiate the project. What you anticipated who your anticipated audiences might have been, who they ended up being, what the book has achieved in your eyes, and ultimately, has it changed your practice at all?
That's great questions. The first one's easier to answer in that it started out of a seminar that I taught on analysis of buildings. And I had each week was, if you privilege plan, what are the consequences of that? If you privilege elevation, what are the consequences of that? So it was really looking at the reciprocity between representational types and the impacts on architectural form. That led to a proposition I had a lecture about section, and I was like, there's not actually a lot of, writing about section. There's a lot about plan. There's not a lot about section. There's a ton on facades and elevations, but section didn't get a lot of attention. And so it was by far the lecture I liked the most. And then when we moved into making a proposition to Princeton Architectural Press about doing a book about representations, and we were trying to find a way that it could be basically a kind of a teaching textbook, a book about diagrams that didn't use diagrams, that was analytical and specific at the same time. We had originally called it the Manual of Cuts, and it was going to have plans and sections and I think elevations. And then the more we worked on it, the more we realized we were much more interested in section, in part because those were the things that we were kind of focusing on the office. So it kind of came out of an interest in section, but also an interest in teaching. And it was designed for that purpose, which is to say that it was meant to be, we did it all black and white drawings, so it could be printed cheaply, so it could be purchased for less than 21 bucks. We wanted to make sure that it wasn't, it was useful. And that at some level, I think that we wanted it to not only kind of talk about section and to make different sections visible, but also to tie them into larger questions of the complexity of the buildings. And frankly, we are also really interested in how, by doing this one section drawing, you could make a project that would be really well known actually visible in a way that wasn't constantly relying on the same handful of drawings that get repeated over and over again. So that's where the kind of maybe there is a level of pretense to this, but we really felt that there could be a visual scholarship that we could do. Could we actually do these as accurate? Could they be a contribution? Not a best guess, but actually be precise. I don't think we were successful on all the projects at all. In fact, there are glaring errors and flaws, but I think it's been beneficial along those lines, as well as they're kind of enjoyable to look at, right? That's what I like about architecture, is how complicated it is. And that's what I like about those drawings, is that you can understand them, but they're not boring. They bring a kind of wealth of information together at the same time. So, and how it's affected our office, I worry that actually that different types have become a constraint Like we feel as though, and there's no question that the Telluride project, we went and go, all right, we're doing a nested section. Let's amplify this. Let's do this explicitly. I worry a little bit along the lines that there are many more ways to approach section, and these dominant types dominate us. That probably is my anxiety. So, but yeah.
Great, thank you.
Sure.
We have another question out there. Panelists, you guys, students must have questions. Here's your chance.
I actually do. Hi, my name's Nat, and I'm really blown away by your lecture. It was really amazing. I actually have a really specific question, kind of maybe like building off of what Meredith just kind of talked about, is how, like, I think like the way that you did this section is almost like this studies of like almost like how students kind of doing this case study. I kind of wonder how like that process of studying like this kind of precedents kind of almost like play out in like your practice in your like firm, because I think like maybe like does it ever kind of come out in the way that you guys maybe almost approaching your like restoration and like renovation work at all, and how almost like studying the context and all that like the pre-existing building, it will kind of change in some sense.
Yeah, I mean, I think, we do a lot of work in plan, and we do a lot of work in section, and we do a lot of work in reflected ceiling plan. And I think that one of the things that we still do is we see those two-dimensional cuts, if you will, as bringing different agendas to the project. And in other words, that when you look at, and I'm kind of looking behind you, when you look at the work in the McKinley and White building, there were certain strategies that were completely based in plan, other ones that could only have been thought out in section, and then those had to also then be coordinated to the reflected ceiling plan. And I think that the way we like to believe we work is that we use the difference between drawing types and the different ways in which they allow you to conceptualize what you can do to beneficial effect, precisely because we don't try to do everything all at the same time. We sometimes work in Rhino, but I would say more often than not, we're working in the distinction between what occurs in these two-dimensional cuts, and then looking at how they all come together, if that makes sense. So, so it's, I think that I would be the first one to say we spend a lot of time designing in plan. We design in massing, but and we don't always start in section. I think the good example was the very first project I showed, the Helen Walton, which we knew was going to be a plan-based project. I mean, it was like, it just, we knew it was going to be that way. And then, even though we tried actually having the building wrap on top of it, so it just was not going to happen from a budget standpoint. But there were moments within that we could look at ways that we could get other effects. So, but yeah, that's a really good question.
We have a question from Alina. Alina, can you speak?
Yes. Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi.
Yeah.
Thank you. It was an excellent lecture, and I definitely learned a lot, and
Good.
there's so much rich information. I'm just curious, while your research for the section, have you come across any ideas or inspiration of what may be a new type of section, given the technology we have nowadays, that weren't able to achieve before? Like, for example, the shape type, we weren't able to achieve that before we kind of have a structural experiment and discovery. So I'm curious.
No, it's a really good question, and it goes to two separate points. One, I was kind of touching on earlier, which is that this is based on buildings and building types that often work with the development of one or two sections, as opposed to they constantly changing. I mean, FOA Yokohama Terminal is an example from 20 years ago that is a very different model of section that we realized couldn't fit into the book because it was about the difference from every single moment within the building. It's the difference of multiple sections that produce that project, right? So the book type resisted that. The other thing that and I don't think I mentioned this, but it's a really important point, is that a lot of the work in the book was framed relative to efficiencies of mostly 19th and 20th century construction types that architects have to contend with. The efficiencies of the floor slab, of the Chicago frame, of the steel frame, et cetera, where it's incredibly not just easy, but in fact, it's economically viable to simply put floor on top of floor on top of floor. And therefore, a lot of the architect's question is, all right, if I'm going to resist this, if I'm going to do something that actually gets away from simply stacking the section, I've got to find a good argument for doing that. And I think this particularly plays itself out in cities, that if you look at, if you start bringing, and it's lurking in the work, but if you bring economics into this, then sections are usually more expensive than, section qualities are more expensive than not having them. So then you got to figure out a really good way to justify them. You've got to find a way that it's not simply for, you know, optics and kind of pleasures of space, but it often has to be connected to other things. So that was lurking, and I think that comes out of the fact we often do work on projects that don't have huge budgets, that we're working within conventional construction types. And I know that that's a lot of our interest in the book was saying, all right, if the assumption is a flat slab that can be repeated, how do you produce vertical variation within that system? So that's, and I should have mentioned that more clearly, because the section types are very much geared towards assuming that, which is also why we limited ourselves mostly to 20th and 21st century examples. One could have an incredible book that was just looking at load-bearing systems with vaults and arches and domes, etc. But we were purposely trying to stay within more 20th century efficiencies. So. But yeah, it's a good question. So
Thank you.
sure.
Sorry, could I ask you to expand on that? When you talked about needing further reason to justify it, other than say the pleasurability of the space, could you give a couple of examples of what that might be? Do you find certain, like, maybe code requirements of like letting certain amounts of light into a space to justify it?
Right. No, it's so if you have to, let's say you're asked to do a performing arts center, right? Or you're asked to do any building, that anything that starts to deviate from the simplest floor slab to like fit the program is going to cost more money. It's just the reality of how things work. Like if you can do it without introducing anything complicated, then it's going to be cheaper. So the question becomes, and I think that for me, the vertical shear is a great example where you can say, look, it's the same amount of square footage. We're building the same amount of square footage. It's just we've now found a way to elaborate a more interesting exchange between the side. Of course, there comes the expense of doing that and so forth, but you're not building more envelope. You're not removing square footage that could hold program and check that off. So I think that, you know, and this lurks a little bit. I mean, certainly certain program types are very, you know, much more driven by this than others. And there's a reason why section doesn't exist in most housing projects, doesn't exist in most office buildings. It doesn't exist in projects that are driven by the efficiencies and the number game of maximizing FAR, right? So, but I think that question of how do you find a way that we all have an ambition to do much more complicated spatial development and formal complexity and et cetera, but that's not always what budgets of projects are thoroughly embracing. So you've got to find a way to align these things. And I would argue that many of the section models we put forward and looked at were ways that worked with certain efficiencies. I mean, the ramp is a good one as well, right? You don't lose any square footage, you just get discontinuity. So that's kind of I'm very interested in that kind of question, right? So, and I think it also does mean that some of the projects that we looked at were in effect we tend to be I tend to be more interested in low budget projects than expensive projects. So architecture is easier when you get bigger budgets. I like cheap projects that are amazing. So but that's another aside. So
Thank you.
I hope that got at the question. It was a really good question.
Yeah, definitely.
So.
Hey, so before we go away, I just wanted to bring up and maybe ask you, Paul, one for a little bit of advice to the students out there. I know we came to your office actually as a group in 2008.
Right.
And it was right at that, I mean, it would have been in April or something. So it was right after the immediacy of the crash. And, we all survived, most of us. And here we are kind of in a strange version of it in a totally different way. And I'm wondering, this is a group of students who, if we think of the group of students then in 2008, I know a number of them launched their own firms. They're out there in the world really trying to do stuff. It's pretty fantastic. What kind of advice would you give this group that are for the next few years?
It's the problems are kind of self-evident, and it's going to be a struggle. But for me, there's a possible, part of, the advice I would give is that it's the argument that don't let a crisis go to waste. It's an opportunity to, in a sense, rethink what the architects can do, and what you're able to be involved in. What can we do as cities? If there is this, we're all going through this incredibly complex change that is, paradigm shifting on so many levels. Are there ways that ability to, set in motion change? Different ways to configure the city, different ways in which you can apply your skills, maybe not necessarily for projects that are geared towards luxury, but geared towards other benefits. There's no question that a huge portion of the architecture world and the economy is driven towards, questions of wealth and the associated projects with that. Are there other ways that we can focus the discipline? So that would be the more optimistic hope. The specifics are tricky, like how do you get funding for it? How do you make that possible? What do you do? But that would be the ambition, is that you take advantage of the shift that this is demanding and is imposing, and find a way that it can be channeled towards a different way to imagine what architects' agencies are and how it gets played out within the built urban realm. So I don't have answers, though. That's the problem. So yeah, and that's the problem, is you have to figure out how you're going to do that. So.
Well, thank you, Paul, for everything always. So we appreciate your time. Thank you, everybody, who we didn't get to hear, but I know are out there, the attendees. And we'll be back next Thursday. Who do we have next Thursday? Do you guys remember? I'm just blanked.
Winka Double Dim?
Yeah, we have Winka Double Dim, so that'll be a fun one too.
That'll be great.
So great. Yeah, we're getting lots of East Coast people out here. So thank you. Thank you, Paul.
The commute was good. All right.
Always appreciate it. Yeah.
Thank you.
Pretty
Thank
easy,
you,
right?
Stephen.
Yeah. Bye, everybody.
Right.
Thank you.
Take care.